Hello everyone, welcome to Dedicated Dentist 32 Reasons Why. Today we'll discuss epidemiology. It's basically the study of distribution of disease and the determinants of health in a specified population, and we apply this study to control that disease in that given population, control the health problems. So there are three types of this epidemiological studies: descriptive, analytical, and experimental, out of which the descriptive and analytical are also called as observational studies, since the epidemiologist or investigator is not interfering or intervening the study. He's just making the observations. Tracing back, it was in 1854 first epidemiological study or descriptive study was done by John Snow, an epidemiologist, also the father of epidemiology. So there was this outbreak or epidemic of cholera in London. He investigated many cases. He did this descriptive study, and only after doing this he realized that he traced the source of it, that outbreak, and he realized that it was the drinking water that was the vessel of transmission of disease and was the center of outbreak. It was causing the disease. He realized that cases were occurring in homes who obtained their water from that Broad Street pump, located in the London, and he realized that it was the center of outbreak. So it is because of this study he came to know about it. So basically, in descriptive study, we are describing the population and the disease in terms of time, place, and person. Because even the disease distribution in terms of its time, also in terms of the individual, can tell us a lot about the disease, about the risk factor associated with the disease. I'll give you an example. Say if we are describing disease in terms of person, we'll come to it later, but still, if we are describing the disease in terms of person, we are talking about his occupation. His occupation can tell us about a lot about it. If he has low socio-economic status, then one that could be a predisposing factor. Also, if he is being exposed to any agent during that occupation, also can tell us about the risk factor associated with the disease. Hence, we study about the individual, its origin. So this basically, the goal of our study is to study the distribution of disease, and if there is an association of the characteristic with the disease. I have written here the characteristics. They can be age, sex, occupation, socio-economic status. It can be anything. Any characteristic can be linked to the disease or the pathogenesis of the disease. So say let's take example of a caries. As a matter of fact, it is more common in low socio-economic status. Also, you might have done the scaling and all, and you might have realized that it is more common in the rural areas or people with low socio-economic status. So this is why we do descriptive study, because there can be risk factors that may be associated with the person's place of origin, place of birth, his occupation, his living habitats, everything. They can be linked. There can be a risk factor, or maybe we can get a clue about the etiology of the disease or what he's being exposed to. So these are the steps in descriptive study. They are: first, defining the population to be studied. We have selected a population for the study, so we have to first define it in terms of numbers and in terms of characteristic, like I said before: age, sex, occupation, culture, ethnic origin, socio-economic status. Everything should be known about the population. Like I said, there is always a link. There could be a risk factor associated with anything. So population, it can be total population, or we can take a sample of it, and that it should be stable. There should not be migration in and out of the population, because this will then disrupt our study. And there should be an healthcare facility nearby. Also, the people, they should actively participate in it. The next step is defining the disease under study. After the population has been defined, we have to give a proper definition to the disease. So it's an epidemiologist who gives a definition. That should be precise and valid, and that helps him identify people with those pathognomic signs and features. So there is always a definition for a disease, right? The next is the describing the disease under the study. Now, like I said, the disease is could be associated with the time, place, and person. Like in the cholera outbreak, it was realized that it was the hand pump, so it was taken care of. Similarly, the disease has to be defined in terms of time, place, and person, and the time distribution can be short-term fluctuation, periodic, and long-term fluctuation. Next, place. Disease is described in terms of place. So there is variation in the frequency of disease from place to place. Again, even place has a role to play in the pathogenesis of disease or in the risk factor. So it can tell us about, give a clue about the etiology or the risk factor. So the geographic pattern of disease distribution, it can reveal the variation in disease, like why is goiter more prevalent in Himalayas. Then there can be international variations, like oral cancer is common in India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and Pakistan, whereas not in Western world. That is because of the oral hygiene practices, not practices actually, but the habits, okay, of the people. Also, there are national variations. Like I said, goiter, malaria, fluorosis, certain countries are affected more than the other. Then there are rural urban variations also. You can see that the drug abuse, bronchitis, cardiovascular diseases, alcoholism, CVS, atherosclerosis, these are more common in the urban areas, whereas the skin infections, Hellman's transmission, and zoonotic infections, or even the periodontal diseases, they are more common in the rural areas. Okay, then we are describing disease in terms of person, an individual. Okay, so even the age of individual, sex, his occupation, his habits can tell us a lot about the disease and can be linked to the risk factor or the etiological factor for the disease. So disease that is described in terms of characteristics like age, sex, occupation, ethnic origin and other host factors, out of which age is very important because the variation in frequency that occurs between different age groups is greater than those found with any other variable. So certain diseases are more prevalent in certain age groups, like measles in childhood, atherosclerosis old age. And there's this term bimodality. That is the occurrence of two peaks in the incidence of disease. Say there's this pit and fissure caries common in children, whereas a root caries is seen only in the old age. Another important characteristic is gender. It's like certain diseases are more common or associated with the sex of an individual. Then there's this occupation. It can tell about the socio-economic status, even the agent that is individual is being exposed to because of his occupation, and even about the patterns of lifestyle, life of people. Say a computer worker has to spend most of his hours in front of the screen, and he follows the sedentary lifestyle, because of which he has heart diseases. So you see how an occupation can tell us a lot about the risk factor or associated etiological factor of the disease. Also, holding nails in mouth by carpenters or pins by tailors, that will cause the attrition and notching of incisors. This is why we always talk about occupation while taking history. Then people playing musical instrument, as their oral cavity is dried because of the playing, they are more conductive to the periodontal diseases. Then comes the socio-economic status, that the frequency of distribution of disease is also associated or different in upper and lower social classes. Like I said, the alcoholism, drug abuse, coronary artery diseases, hypertension, these are more common in upper class, whereas skin and zoonotic infections, periodontal infections, they are more in lower class. Now comes the step, measurement of disease. So we measure disease in terms of the mortality and morbidity. Also incidence and prevalence, that is done by cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. I also have a video on incidence and prevalence. Please do check that out. Then comparing with the known indices. The essence of any epidemiological study is to make comparison. We can make comparison between the same population or subgroup of population or different populations. So this can tell about the etiology. If that particular population A has been exposed to an agent and B has not been, so it can also tell about it. It can also tell about the population that is at higher risk of developing disease and why. Then comes the last and most important step of descriptive epidemiology, that is formulation of etiological hypothesis. If we say that smoking is associated with leukoplaskia, no, that is not an hypothesis. Hypothesis, it should specify the population, the cause, the outcome, that is the disease, the dose relationship, the time response relationship. Just saying that smoking causes leukoplaskia isn't a hypothesis. Hypothesis is like smoking 40-50 BDs per day will result in leukoplaskia among 4% of smokers. So after we have formulated this hypothesis, we put to test it in the analytical study that again has two studies, case control and cohort, that will be learning in the subsequent videos. But for now, the most important thing about descriptive study is we find an association between the risk factors or the characteristics of an individual with the disease, and then we put it to test in the analytical study. It is the analytical study which decides whether to accept it or reject it. So in the next video, we'll discuss the analytical study, case control and cohort study. Till then, take care. Thank you.